Hello and welcome to the programme that brings together BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, one virus, three countries, the contrasting COVID fortunes of China, the United States and the UK. Afghanistan's president says it'll take 6 months for him and his army to rout the Taliban. But does he have 6 weeks? Joining me to discuss that this week are Henry Chu, UK Bureau Chief of the American newspaper, the LA Times, Ned Temko, who's with the Christian Science Monitor, and in the studio with me, Damien Grammaticus, BBC's political correspondent. Welcome to all of you. Lovely to have you with us this week. Good to have you with us at home as well. Thanks for watching. Now, it's been a week of contrasting fortunes in the global pandemic. Here in the UK, Wales will lift its COVID restrictions over the weekend. Scotland will do so from Monday. It's 3 weeks since Boris Johnson did the same for England. Fears of a significant surge in cases following that have not been borne out, and the number of people requiring hospitalisation appears to have stabilised. There's also been the first fall in the number of infections since the end of May, and a reduction below 1 of the reinfection rate. In other words, the virus is not growing in the population. Well, the Delta variant, first identified in India, is now the dominant strain, however, and not just in the UK. In the United States, it's led Dr. Anthony Fauci, the infectious diseases expert who's been advising US presidents since the early 1980s, to warn Sunday that the US was going in the wrong direction. In Wuhan, the Chinese city where the virus was first detected in late 2019, the authorities have announced they're testing the entire population. The Delta variant has brought COVID back home with a vengeance. Damien, what's happening there at the moment?
Well, China is really interesting at the minute. I mean, let's go back to the beginning of the pandemic. We know, of course, those first cases that appeared in Wuhan. Then China mobilized this response, and it's the sort of thing when you, having lived in Beijing, you get used to. China can sort of mass these resources and pull the levers of sort of state power and really impose sort of policies, if it wants, that are very, being an authoritarian regime, that are very, very sort of centrally directed. We saw that. It sort of squashed that first wave. And has then
walls to kind of close off roads at one point. Things like
yes, I mean, people confined to their homes. Only one person in your household allowed out every 3 days to go and get food. Entire cities, placed under lockdown. So very, very strict measures. That has worked. And China returned to a level of normality. But what we have seen is, with this new Delta variant, there was a flight, it appears, from Moscow into Nanjing about a month ago, which brought that virus in. And it appears that it was airport workers cleaning the plane who carried that out and spread it. And it just shows the dangers, I think, of how this new variant is spreading. China now has seen this popping up around the place. It's still very low numbers. I think the figures are now about 1,500 cases total in the last few weeks, 80 or so a day on average. But we are seeing again these sort of measures coming back in, because it's the difficulty for China is it's in provinces all along the east. In the city of Yangzhou, that's 4.5 million. Nanjing is over 5 million, 6 million. You've got Wuhan, 11 million, all being tested. People in Zhengzhou, in further north, not allowed out of the city without a negative test. Mass testing, controls on long-distance travel, trying to squash it, but it's a challenge for China, and they're asking questions now about, can they continue with these sort of policies?
Yeah, it sounds like a complicated game of whack-a-mole that's being played there. Ned, in the UK, despite all the predictions, it looks at the moment as if the vaccination programme and the other measures have worked, at least in restraining the Delta variant. We're not out of the wood yet, but when you compare it with what's happening in China and elsewhere in the world, what's your assessment?
Well, that they're extraordinarily fortunate, and it really has been quite a turn of events, because when so-called Freedom Monday happened 3 weeks ago, the great majority of public health professionals, scientists here, were deeply concerned, because here at one fell swoop, all or virtually all the restrictions were going at the very time that the Delta variant was surging in Britain as everywhere else. But for reasons we may fully understand only in the months ahead, like so much about this virus, it was that the dog that didn't bark. I mean, the case numbers have come right down. Hospitalizations, of course, remain low. So do deaths, thankfully. And it appears that a combination of this undeniably successful vaccination program, and I guess just the start of something resembling herd immunity has, at least for now, put them in a very good place compared to the rest of the world. The one thing I'd add very briefly is it's interesting that Boris Johnson, the prime minister's, the health secretary, other senior figures have been very, very careful not to take a victory lap yet, because I think they know, as we all do, that this virus doesn't take political orders.
Henry, that's a very good way of getting us to the United States, where despite the political orders, despite the power of the bully pulpit of the president, Joe Biden's incentives, all the other things, he can't seem to get past this problem that vaccination, like so much else in American politics, has become politicized, and that there is still, apparently, up to, I think if you add the figures together of those who say they won't take it and those who are resistant to taking it, 37% of Republican voters probably not vaccinated at the moment, and probably not going to be.
It does cleave along partisan lines like that, as you say, and we see that the states that have the lowest vaccination rates are ones that we would call red states, Republican states. So, for example, the least vaccinated state, fully vaccinated state, is Alabama, which voted heavily for Trump. It's got about a 40% vaccination rate of people 12 and over, whereas you compare that to Vermont, which is admittedly a smaller state, but up in New England, a very liberal state, it has a vaccination rate of 77%. But that just tells you that the U.S. overall, as such a big country, is a mixed picture. You have right now the Delta variant surging. That's absolutely true. We have about more than 70,000 cases being registered a day, and a third of those this last week were in just 2 states alone, Florida and Texas, where the Republican governors have decided not to take more active measures to try to suppress that spread. Now, they're very populous states, but my own state, California, which is the most populous state of all, has taken more drastic measures. They're just about having masks on indoors again in places like the Bay Area up north and in Los Angeles. That has helped now tamp down the spread. So it's a mixed bag in the U.S. One thing to remember, though, when I say that there are 70,000 new cases a day, that's more than twice what you have in Britain. But our population is 5 times that of Britain. So it's always important to keep numbers in mind. Just as Damien was saying about China, the cases there are growing, but they're still minuscule compared to countries in the West.
What about this debate then for all of you that Tedros Ghebreyesus, the former Ethiopian health minister who now runs the World Health Organization, was making yet again this week, that this is an uneven recovery from COVID, if that's what we're saying, that it's still the rich world versus everybody else in terms of supply of virus. No signs of the new production capacity that was promised back in the summer by the G7. No real signs of the international charter, the global charter that Boris Johnson said he wanted in place. And when Mr. Ghebreyesus says, as he said this week, that we shouldn't be having booster vaccines, which the British are planning, until poorer nations have vaccines too, he gets a response like from the White House on Friday, Ned, it's a false choice and we can do both. Well, they're plainly not doing both.
I think that's true, but I think it's a recognition that the political pressure internationally will grow. I think what they're reckoning on, not just the American government, but governments in the developed world that are fortunate enough to have the option, for instance, to consider boosters, is that their main political concern immediately, it's just realpolitik, is the folks at home. And it's a kind of primary responsibility to keep them safe and try and reopen. I think what will be fascinating is to see the degree to which America in particular tries to take a lead in really ramping up production and delivery to underdeveloped countries, because after all, the Biden administration's foreign policy mantra has been America is back. We're in a kind of struggle between democracy and autocracy internationally. And President Biden sees America as reasserting democratic leadership. Now, one traditional area where that used to be done is in fact, in vaccination for lots of other diseases in Africa and other, not just, under recent presidents, but under George W. Bush, for instance, with HIV medicines and inoculation. And I think I think the American administration will make a more visible effort in the weeks ahead to get that done.
Yeah, I think there are various vexed issues involved here. Certainly, you do have a very uneven distribution around the world of vaccines. Right now, I think the WHO says that of the 4 billion doses that have been administered so far, 80% of them have been in countries that are home to less than half of the population, and they tend to be wealthier countries like Britain, like the US. So that's absolutely the case. And you have the WHO chief shifting his red lines, because if you remember, just a few months ago, there was the argument that no country should be vaccinating youths, vaccinating children or teenagers until adults were vaccinated. And now that shifted to there shouldn't be any booster shots. And there isn't much more objection being made to younger people getting vaccinated. The US, I think, says it's stepping up. It's delivered about 100 million doses to over 60 countries, and Biden has said that there will be a pledge of 1 billion. Today, you heard China saying that they're going to supply 2 billion doses. It's not just about supply, though. It's also about distribution. And so COVAX, which is the consortium that's supposed to help get these shots in arms in poor countries around the world, particularly, it's not just about getting those vaccines over there. You have countries where vaccines are going spoiling because they haven't been administered quickly enough. There hasn't been enough training of people to actually inoculate folks in their constituencies. So it isn't purely a matter of supply at this point.
Damien, last thought on that.
Yes, I mean, I think it's to pick up on two of those things. I mean, what Henry was saying about, the uneven distribution, it's interesting. Here in the UK, you do see, the government here has put many of its eggs in this vaccine basket. This is the big success for the UK government. So they've rolled this out. As you say, they're talking now, they're bringing the vaccines down to 16, 17-year-olds, already planning for third shots later in the year. So a lot of success here, but the UK hasn't been exporting vaccines. It's donated a very small amount, which went in the last few days. I think 400,000 went to Kenya. But look at Kenya. Population there of, I think, 50 million. It's had 1.5 million doses, less than 1% fully vaccinated. Look at other very, very poor countries. Yemen, South Sudan, 0% fully vaccinated. And so what we're seeing is the entrenchment of these sort of differences, the distinctions between rich and poor, but also, what importantly Ned was saying, that political narrative. So China, the President Xi Jinping was talking about the success of the Chinese system, showing how valuable and how much better it had reacted. China is on this huge drive to vaccinate. From almost a standing start in March, they've done 1.7 billion doses, 17 million a day going out now. But that means that China is not exporting at the minute to other countries. And also China is again finding, I think it's in a difficult position because it's going to see other Western countries starting to open up. Yes. And these political questions will then come back, I think, about which actually is the best approach.
Fascinating stuff. I know we'll talk about it again. Thank you all very much. Now, in Afghanistan, the departure of foreign troops appears to have heralded not an Afghan army able to stand up and defend itself and its people, but the return of the Taliban. Further and faster, one former UN official told me this week, than most had predicted. The assassination Friday of the chief government spokesperson and seizing of a regional capital, Zaranj in Nimruz province, evidence of the brittle nature of security in a country that has never really emerged from war. As the Taliban lays siege to cities, President Ashraf Ghani told the country he had a 6-month strategy for dealing with the Taliban. Ned, has he got 6 weeks, was the question I asked in the intro. I mean, as Mark Malloch-Brown, the former UN development chief, who was there at the beginning in the early 2000s, was saying to me this week, the Taliban have moved further and faster than almost anyone had predicted they would.
I think he's absolutely right. And as for whether this plan is workable or exists, it kind of resonates from the old Vietnam War days in which there was always a secret American plan to get out of the war, to win the war. And I think this will be seen with some skepticism. It is true that the situation on the ground is fluid, but the flow is, at least so far, all in one direction, and that's in the favor of the Taliban. And I think if there is a break or if there's a if it's diverted somehow and that we stop short of a kind of full-scale assault on some of these provincial capitals, it will be only in part the Afghan government forces. It will depend on other things. First of all, the Americans, who in theory are going to be out completely by August 31st, but in the last few days have, for instance, been stepping up airstrikes in defense of the government forces. And perhaps most fascinatingly and importantly, other regional powers. And for them, it's almost a situation of kind of be careful what you wish for, because they've all been quite vocally critical of America's presence in Afghanistan and the NATO allies' presence in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. But I think the speed and abruptness of the total American withdrawal has left a vacuum that each, for their own reasons, is concerned about.
Now, I want to talk a bit about what neighbouring countries do, the dilemma they face in a moment. But Henry, just before we do that, it sounded slightly ludicrous to say, I've got a 6-month plan. But actually, might he have a point? Could it be that traditional saviour of embattled Afghan governments, the winter, that actually forestalls any fall of this government?
In the past, you've seen fighting definitely dwindle during the very, very cold winter months. But as Ned and you yourself just mentioned, the speed at which the Taliban is now galloping towards the major population centers like Kandahar, and now even mounting attacks, as it has always been doing, but even more high-profile ones in Kabul, is really quite staggering. And so this idea of having 6 months to wait to be able to actually rout the Taliban, I think might indeed be a pipe dream on President Ghani's part. I mean, right now, we're already seeing a provincial capital fall, as you mentioned, various crossing points into other countries, such as Pakistan and Iran, now being controlled by the Taliban. And increasingly, if some of the provincial capitals and Kabul itself are able to hold out, what you'll have are simply islands of government control. But then there again, they could be blockaded by the rest of the Taliban, of the country being under the Taliban's thumb. So I think the idea of 6 months, half a year is, a lot can change during that time. But I don't think with what we're seeing right now, if that's any sign of the trend that's going to be going on over the next couple of months, that President Ghani actually has that. And I think the United States realizes this now. I mean, they're seeing the consequence of having announced almost without notifying NATO and some of the other allies that they were going to pull out by September 11th. That was the original deadline. It caught everybody on the hop. Now realizing that perhaps some continued air support is going to be necessary, but the idea of boots back on the ground, that's not going to happen. And so I'm unfortunately thinking that we're going to be seeing a Taliban overrun earlier than any of us had expected, certainly 2 or 3 months ago.
In those circumstances, David, I mean, you spent some years covering and reporting the Afghanistan story when you were based in the region, so you've been into the country a number of times. You've seen this unfold over that very long 20-year period. It's not surprising, is it, that other countries like Pakistan, Turkmenistan are making a calculation and saying, actually, it's time to cozy up to the Taliban because they could be in power very soon?
Well, I think, so Henry and I were both in South Asia and watching this situation at a similar time. Pakistan, of course, has always had very, very close relationship and ties and links with the Taliban, using Pakistani areas as sort of rear bases. That's always been a big sort of part of the calculation. India is a big player in this as well. China with its own border with Afghanistan, and obviously that's the region of Xinjiang where China has that, that huge, at the minute, that policy with China, very repressive policies in Xinjiang, very concerned about the possibility of violence from across the border.
Over the borders, yeah.
Yes, so and Russia, of course, looking down. So you have many different players all looking at this, and then in Western countries too. But I would say, I think it's very difficult actually to call, how this is going to play out, because Afghanistan has always had this very sort of grinding, complex, patchwork of conflicts and relationships going on.
Meanwhile, no government has ever truly controlled the whole of the country, has it? You've had so many regional power plays. It's
incredibly difficult, I think, because I went there when you saw the Taliban, their sort of resurgence coming back after we'd had September the 11th, 2001, sort of later, 2006, 7, 8. Taliban came back, foreign forces went back in. there in the south near Kandahar with the Canadians, they had their Operation Medusa. Then they went in to clear an area, and you saw on the ground how hard it was, even for a major sort of Western military. They had satellite photographs, they had, daily planning, moving forward inch by inch. Even that took weeks to dislodge the Taliban. They left and they came back, snuck back into districts, targeted with improvised explosives, suicide bombers, killed local officials working with the government. We're seeing this sort of similar thing again. So it's very difficult, even with all that military backing, for a central government to control power. But at the same time, you have a patchwork, and the Western militaries used to look at the very local tribal affiliations, because all of these matter. And that makes it very hard, I think. The Taliban is not one thing. It's, again, local affiliations. Money plays a part. Power plays a part. So for them to mount a sort of coordinated response is also a difficult thing. And I think what we're likely to see is this grinding on, and we see these assassinations. The government spokesman today, we've had a high-profile academic, comic, journalists, civilians dying.
Acting defence minister earlier in the week, yeah.
I think the most likely thing is this sort of conflict where we see civilians. I think 1,000 deaths, the UN has been told today, 1,000 deaths in the last few weeks. The civilians really caught in the brunt of this, and it's a very messy picture that could play out for a long time.
Henry, just a last thought on this, if I may. Ned said earlier, America is back. That's the Biden rhetoric. When Afghans aren't seeing America's back, they're just seeing America's back. It really starts to raise questions, doesn't it, about what that actually means.
Well, I think Biden, what he meant by America being back was really that it was back together with its allies, that the powers that had counted on U.S. support and backing throughout these many decades, particularly here in Europe, but also in Asia, that they can once again count on the U.S. to be by their side. But this is bitterly ironic in showing that when America acts unilaterally, which it, as I referred to, practically did in announcing that it was going to pull out of Afghanistan without really consulting NATO very well, that also causes ructions. And unfortunately, that's playing out on the ground in Afghanistan. And to Damien's point about civilians being caught in the middle, we haven't really talked about the battle for hearts and minds. And from all the reporting that our own correspondents at the LA Times have done out there, it's a populace that has been itself ground down in this grinding war, and which they're totally exhausted by the conflict, and they're looking to any power now, whether it's the U.S. or the Taliban, who can restore just some form of semblance of stability and order. And I think that's not to be counted out either as we go into these next few months.
Henry, thank you very much. We've just got about 3 minutes left. A chance for each of you to kind of pitch what story we should be paying a bit more attention to than perhaps we had. Can I start off with you, Ned? And what I might call the anniversary waltz.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'd like to talk about two countries, both of which are undergoing a particularly difficult time. One is Myanmar, and the other is Lebanon, which has a particular place in my journalistic heart, because one of my first jobs was covering the Lebanese Civil War in the late 70s, and I have lots of dear friends that are still there. And it will not have escaped any of us that there has been a fair amount of coverage these past few days of both Myanmar and the military dictatorship there, and the situation in Lebanon 1 year after that terrible explosion in Beirut port. But in both cases, the coverage has been kind of a result of the calendar.
Yeah.
And I suppose my concern is what happens once this calendar tips over to the next day and the next week. Do we risk forgetting about the terribly difficult situation in both countries?
Thank you. Henry.
Just looking at the coverage that we've had over the last few weeks on climate change and climate disasters around the world, we're really realizing that it's hitting rich countries. As somebody I once spoke to said, it's a rich country problem now in a way that perhaps it hadn't been borne in on countries like the US, Canada, Germany before. But now we've seen catastrophic floods in Central Europe, Central and Western Europe. We've seen an extremely deadly heat wave in the Northwest, and that's made everybody sit up in these countries. But let's not forget that climate change has been hitting poor countries disproportionately hard. And Madagascar in particular, where we're seeing a famine happening before our eyes, which might be the first famine in modern history that is purely from climate change and not because of man-made causes.
Thank you very much. You've got 20 seconds, Damien.
I think we should go to the Olympics. I mean, we had the Belarusian athlete who sought asylum. That's put the spotlight back on Belarus and the human rights abuses there. But we've had a lot of sort of grim talk. So let's also remember those two high jumpers who shared gold. And I think that was a moment worth reflecting on this.
Damien Gramaticus, Henry Chu and Ned Temko, thank you all very much. And thank you too.